welcome to our lecture that is really just an introduction to research. What are the key concepts? How do we approach research? And how do we apply it in educational situations? So first off is defining really what is research. And a lot of times research is given a little bit too lofty of a definition. So research is really systematic investigation. So having a structured and organized way that you're going to investigate something or gather information is research. Any type of information that develops or contributes to knowledge is also research. And in fact, the whole purpose of research is to create new understanding, insights, or even solutions that add to the existing body of knowledge. And we also want research to be generalizable knowledge. So we don't want it to be so specific to a specific scenario that it can't be generalized so that the community as a whole can learn from it. So the findings from research should really be applicable beyond any specific context and be applied a lot more broadly. So in simplest terms, research is really just a critical process that enables us to expand our knowledge and advance in how we understand academic disciplines. And when I say that this is often too lofty of a goal, what I mean is, let's say you have a student in your class who's a consistent behavioral problem, and you're trying to find a way to help that student focus in class. You're going to go online, you're going to look at things, you're going to dig for information, and you're going to create a plan for that student. You did research. And so to complete the second half of that, the way that we would get to contributing knowledge would be to write it up, make it a case study. I had a student, these were the things that we were struggling with, here's all the information that I found and how it looked when it was implemented. Now there are permissions and other things to get involved in, but this is just a really quick and simple example of a way that something we do every day in the classroom can translate over to meaningful research that allows an entire community to benefit from what you did and not just continuing to benefit as an individual. So for me, research is about the ripples that we send out in the world and not about keeping something that I've learned within my own world and my own understanding. And there are different types of research approaches, and there's a very false narrative here that so-and-so is a quantitative person or so-and-so is a qualitative person. I conduct qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research coming from a background of a master's in math. So most people, when they look at me, they're like, oh, she would typically do quantitative research. She doesn't do qualitative. And I just wrapped a huge qualitative study, and I'm conducting another mixed method study right now, and I've got another qualitative one. So even though I'm a STEM person, I often find the most rewarding research that I do comes from talking and understanding the shared experiences of different groups of people. So these are the three research approaches, but it's not as simple as like you're a math person or you're not a math person. It's really about looking at what you're trying to figure out and finding the best path forward. So quantitative research really focuses in on finding a pattern. It's a scientific method, so I have a hypothesis. I think when I do this, this is going to happen. That is quantitative. That should never be qualitative. If you're predicting something, like I'm going to change curriculums and test scores are going to go up, that is quantitative research. It uses things like surveys, questionnaires, or experiments, and typically it's going to involve a relationship between something you're measuring. Now that relationship could have a non-number component. So you could be looking at differences across genders or differences across racial identities. Those are not quantitative in nature, but when we're comparing groupings of people, the things that we're grouping them by might be qualitative in nature. And qualitative research means you're walking in as a blank slate. You have no preconceived notions. You don't even know what you're going to find. You're just going to talk to people And then you're going to find out what you find out. And that's often what makes qualitative research, in my opinion, one of the most difficult types of research, because your opinions, your thoughts, and your bias have to be left at the door. And that's a really hard thing to do. And so it's really about leaving all of that baggage at the door so that you can understand the meaning or the shared and lived experiences of different groups of people. And this could be done with an interview. It could be done in a focus group. It could be done in open-ended survey questions. There's a lot of different ways that this could be done. And once you've kind of gathered the information, you are looking for themes that are happening across what multiple people said. And you're looking for, is there a particular narrative that when I combine everything together and all of the people together, is there a type of shared narrative between those people? And then mixed method research is kind of the best of both worlds. You get to have a hypothesis, and you also can have a more structured approach, so you're not just going in to understand, but you are going to collect both numerative data and some type of narrative data. And typically a mixed method tends to be heavily quantitative or heavily qualitative. It's never going to be an even play. So think about it like this. My current study that I'm conducting right now with a group of externs is looking at how an AI tutor increases student achievement on an NCLEX test. So we're basically giving them a pre-test and a post-test. That's quantitative data. I said to myself, it's not enough for me to just compare numbers to see how they did comparatively. I want to know what their experience is with the tutor, so that as I find those numeric patterns, I have some additional insight into what it's like to be a user. So that way I'm not getting, like, their score might have gone up, but they may have really struggled with interacting with the artificial intelligence. Their score might have gone down, but maybe they had some technical difficulties, or maybe they had difficulty with the language, the reading level, or something else. So mixed method research really allows us to take in the whole picture. And so when I talk to people about mixed methods, I'm like, are you going to be satisfied with just a numeric answer? Are you going to be satisfied with just an interview and themes across people? Or are you also going to want some type of supporting numerical evidence? That's really what drives us to our different approaches. And so when we're following this quantitative approach, we have specific tests that we conduct. And those tests are done using Microsoft Excel, SPSS. So none of the quantitative research methods are done by hand. And that's a really common misconception, is that we're doing things by hand. We're not. Speaking from a place of experience, I am not going to crunch 500 participants' data by myself. In fact, just entering that data into the software is a challenge in and of itself. So we're going to utilize some type of software, and by doing that utilization process, I'm able to get an objective and measurable insight. And so there's also a strategy here. So are you trying to collect evidence and make a case for something that maybe would have a financial impact in your district? So maybe you want access to a particular tool. They're going to want to say, show me the numbers. So if I'm going to someone and asking permission or asking for them to spend money, I make sure there's some type of quantitative component, because people are going to want to have a measurement of benefit. And so quantitative research can really show us that measurement of benefit. So qualitative research, though, really gives us insight into the human aspect of things. So you get to know why. So a lot of times in qualitative research, and in the studies that I most recently conducted that were qualitative, I was really looking to make recommendations for policies in artificial intelligence, but I was trying to understand why and how people used it, so that when I was looking at why and how, I could then explain how it should be implemented at the K-12 level, because I understood how adults were using it and the impact that it had on their lives. So I was kind of writing what we call a phenomenology, which is a lived experience of people, and they talked about their anxieties, they talked about their goals, they were very candid about their struggles, and they were able to tell me what they did with artificial intelligence to augment that. And really being able to say, this is the story of these people. This is not Dr. Robinson saying this. It has a much stronger impact to say, I had a person in the study say that their best friend in school told them that they were the stupidest smart person they had ever met. And it was somebody who was dyslexic, and that had a long-term impact on them. So telling that story through that person's words is so much more meaningful when I'm making recommendations than me saying, I think that if we could add artificial intelligence in, that it would increase things. So I'm telling it from someone's perspective who's already lived it. And that's kind of really the advantage of qualitative research, and that's kind of the beauty of it. It's an incredibly touching experience to be able to tell it from that perspective. And then again, mixed methods is where we're starting to combine things. So maybe you're primarily interested in knowing that lived experience, but you might want to have a component of how would you rate your anxiety levels before you were using AI versus after? How would you rate your ability to break down complicated tasks? So there could be a rating component that leads you to some type of quantitative piece of it. And so what you will see is the trend in journal articles of late is really towards this mixed method perspective, because a lot of times one method doesn't encompass it. And with that said, though, I kind of like to use the save the cheerleader, save the world analogy. One researcher can't do everything. So even if you are doing a quantitative study, you could suggest in the future that someone do a mixed method study, because it is a lot more resources to be able to get those interviews and to do that coding process. So don't feel like you have to take on everything at one time. Maybe you just have time to do this now, and then you might revisit it, or you might suggest that someone else do it a different way. So what does a research project look like, or journal article? And so we will call these manuscripts. That is the industry standard term. It's not a paper. It is a manuscript, and we call it a scholarly manuscript. And it is really a comprehensive academic work that shows expertise and contribution. So what does that mean? That means that when you're writing this manuscript, you not only have to give your results, you have to set everything up by reading journal articles and talking about what you're seeing from other studies people have done that are similar to your own. And that's where the academic component comes in. You have to get into the literature. You have to read journal articles on topics that are similar to yours. You have to understand what have other people found so that you understand how your research contributes to the field. Research is often considered a defining component of a doctoral education. And so a lot of people, when we talk about research, like that's for your dissertation or that's for your thesis, it's part of your degree. And what's really interesting is that a dissertation or even a thesis is very different from research that's actually published in journals. You're going to find that there's a very structured process around any type of within a school research that you're doing in a degree program versus what you would do outside if you were done with your degree program. And really that's all about having milestone and checkpoints along the way. But it is very different from just a research project. So when we talk about a dissertation, that's not a scholarly manuscript, that is a dissertation. When we talk about a thesis, that's not necessarily a scholarly manuscript, that is a thesis. So another defining way that they're different is that In my journal articles I've published this year, my lit review is maybe 4 pages long, whereas in a dissertation it can be 30 to 60 pages long. So there is this real difference in what we consider research in kind of the real world and what we consider research within an institution. And so research has a process, and this is going to be the process we're utilizing in this class. The first thing is you have to identify a problem. Research cannot be because, oh, I think this is going really well in my classroom. There has to be some type of problem that is big in your field. And so in education, I ask people, it has to pass the so what test. So if you think you found a problem, you should be able to say, so what to it. So what do I mean by that? I mean that a problem is not that kids can't sit in a desk for 5 hours a day. We already know that. That's not a problem. A problem is that there are inherent distractors in a classroom that are preventing a student from succeeding. If we don't fix those distractors, then the student's never going to get what they need, and they're not going to be able to have the opportunities that an education would open for them. So research problems have to have a long-term issue. So it's not just a here and now, it's a long-term issue that if we don't solve this, we are going to see an impact on society as a whole, in addition to whatever the personal impact of the individual is. Once you've identified that problem, you can't dive into research and dive into data collection. You have to dive into what have other people studied when it comes to this problem. So what have other people looked at when we're talking about distractions in the classroom? What theories apply to distractions in the classroom? Have people done mostly quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method studies? So you kind of need to understand the context that surrounds what has already been decided in that field about that problem. Only after you have really immersed yourself and read 60 articles, 20 articles, 40 articles, can you even think about collecting data to be able to analyze it yourself and then being able to present your findings. It's also important to note that you cannot collect data unless you've gone to an international review board or an IRB. So any research that is published or presented runs through an IRB. We have one here. And the goal of that organization and that process is to make sure that identities are protected and that people are protected and not impacted by any inequity that might result or stem from your research. As you're actively doing your study, so that's a little bit further than we'll get in this class, but as you're actively doing that study, once you've got your approval, you can collect your data, and that can look very different for every study. That data could be a data set. That data could be recordings and transcripts of interviews. Data is not the traditional spreadsheet data when it comes to research. It could be observations. So there are studies that are purely observational, like ethnographies. There are studies that include reflective journaling because you're a part of the system that you're studying or the culture that you're studying. And you really have to make sure that you maintain your academic integrity, which means you're properly citing everything. And in academic manuscripts, even if it's just an omission on accident, it is a big deal. So it is really critical to layer in protections to make sure that you're doing a lot of proofreading and that you are giving proper citations at all times to anything that you've pulled in. And finally, when you're writing research, whether your dissertation, thesis, or whatever, we all kind of follow this structure where there's an introduction where you talk about the problem and why it's important. You talk about what has everyone else done when it comes to this. Then you talk about what am I going to do? The methodology is purely how are you going to study this? The results are what you find, and it is purely factual. So I found this. It's not, you're not interpreting it, you're not trying to extend it, you're just saying, here are my results. The discussion is where you get to start saying, I found this, so therefore I think it means this. Or I found that and I have questions, or there needs to be further research. Or I found, or there were themes across things. Or maybe you feel like the score doesn't really reflect what's happening in the situation. The discussion is the place for you to think about, what are all of your thoughts on why you found what you found? What were the limitations that you got into as you started to do the research? And then your conclusion is really that tight summary that's pulling it all together. So even if you're working on it as a thesis or a doctoral student, it's the same sections and the same dividing up of work as it is for any kind of journal article or traditional research publication. And so as you're starting to think about what might the topics be that I'm interested in, this is kind of how I suggest doing it. Make a list of things that you're interested in. Go to the library and look up some articles on it. What have other people said about it? Write down what their questions were. Maybe your questions are different. Maybe your questions are a different approach. Maybe you're looking at a different application of it. Then you're going to think about, what do you feel is really unanswered? Do you feel like maybe there was a lot of quantitative research on this, but nobody bothered to ask why or how things happened? Nobody bothered to look at the lived experiences of the people? There's always some type of gap involving that. And then try to write a question that you're going to answer in your research, and look for feedback. Talk to your peers, talk to colleagues, talk to me. Talk to people and be like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about this question? What do you think the answer is? And only after you have really sat with that and really fleshed it out, can you begin the research process. And that's determining what's feasible for you. Continuing to read literature, refining your question, and rethinking constantly about the feasibility of what you want to do. And that is our first lecture. Have a great week.